during a blazing Texas morning in June 1899. Within the isolated expanses of the state's eastern region, a neighbor's customary check-in at the Yates homestead would reveal a scene of such devastating horror that it would forever torment the small settlement of Cedar Creek. Within the humble timber dwelling, 5 children lay motionless in their sleeping quarters, their existence terminated by the same hands that had previously rocked them to slumber. Margaret Yates, a woman formerly celebrated as an exemplary pioneer spouse, had systematically taken the lives of her offspring before attempting suicide herself. However, this wasn't the deed of an evil being. This represented the devastating finale of a gradual mental deterioration that the entire community had witnessed, yet nobody had genuinely comprehended. The warning signs had been present for months, discussed in quiet conversations at the trading post, brushed aside as merely a mother's fleeting sadness. What truly compelled the dedicated mother to perform such an inconceivable deed? The solution lies concealed within the stifling loneliness of pioneer existence, the overwhelming burden of unrealistic demands, and the community's inability to acknowledge the urgent pleas for assistance that resonated across the Texas grasslands, like wind through an abandoned dwelling. Prior to exploring this disturbing story from Texas history's forgotten archives, this channel caters to a specific audience, only those courageous enough to face the most sinister periods of American frontier existence. Should you be prepared to discover the reality behind tales that others refuse to share? Click that subscribe button and inform us in the comments which state you're listening from. We maintain a community of genuine mystery enthusiasts here. Having reached this point clearly sets you apart from ordinary people. Allow me to transport you to that fateful summer when the Texas sun's intensity paled in comparison to the flames of insanity that devoured the Yates household. Cedar Creek, Texas, during 1899, represented the type of community where all residents knew each other's affairs. Despite this, the most crucial secrets stayed concealed within private homes. This modest agricultural settlement of merely 300 residents existed like an isolated outpost within eastern Texas's boundless territory, where the closest actual town required an entire day's journey to reach. The terrain proved unforgiving yet honest. It compensated diligent effort while punishing weakness without compassion. This environment precisely attracted individuals like Thomas Yates, a robust German settler who had arrived 5 years prior, possessing only weathered hands and unwavering faith that America's frontier would bring him prosperity. Thomas had secured 160 acres through the Homestead Act, constructed a simple 2-level home with his own labor, and established himself among the region's more successful farmers. His grain fields extended beyond sight, golden waves that swayed in Texas's perpetual wind. Yet a thriving farm required more than diligent work. It demanded a suitable wife, someone capable of bearing offspring, maintaining a household, and serving as a moral cornerstone within the community. This is where Margaret O'Brien's story begins. At 19, she was deemed nearly too mature for marriage according to frontier customs, yet her attractiveness and gentle reputation made her a desirable match. She had been raised in Austin, where her father served as a state government clerk, a comfortable middle-class existence that provided her with education, sophistication, and absolutely no preparation for frontier farming's harsh realities. Her parents, anxious to ensure her future before permanent spinsterhood, eagerly approved Thomas's marriage proposal, following only 2 brief encounters. The wedding occurred during spring 1892. A modest ceremony at the small Methodist church serving Cedar Creek's dispersed congregation. Margaret appeared radiant, wearing her mother's modified wedding gown, her auburn locks elegantly arranged, her emerald eyes shining with optimism and resolve. The townspeople commented on what an attractive pair they formed, Thomas with his wide shoulders and grave manner, Margaret with her kind smile and refined behavior that indicated superior upbringing compared to most frontier women. During those initial years, Margaret seemed to exemplify everything a frontier wife should represent. She mastered cow milking, butter churning, and maintaining a vegetable garden that became other wives' envy. She could preserve produce, repair clothing with detailed stitching, and prepare meals that made Thomas the most envied husband across 3 counties. When she delivered their first child, William, in 1893, other women commended her innate maternal abilities and predicted she would raise numerous strong sons to assist with farm work. Children indeed arrived regularly as anticipated on the frontier, where large families meant additional workers and protection against high child mortality rates. Following William came Sarah. Thomas listened politely, but dismissed her worries with a hand wave. Women become emotional sometimes, particularly after childbirth, he stated matter-of-factly. Margaret's always been somewhat delicate, comes from city upbringing. She simply needs to strengthen up, learn to handle things as frontier women do. She'll recover. Yet Margaret wasn't recovering, and incidents began multiplying. Sarah Brennan, who operated the general store, mentioned to other women that Margaret had visited twice, purchasing identical supplies, appearing confused when Sarah noted she had bought the same items the previous week, during church services. Several people observed that Margaret would sometimes begin weeping quietly during hymns, tears flowing down her face while she stared ahead with profound sadness. The children's behavior also began changing. William, the eldest at 6, started appearing at neighbors' homes, requesting food, claiming his mother had forgotten meal preparation. Young Sarah, normally a cheerful child, became withdrawn and clingy, refusing to let her mother leave her sight. The twins developed hiding habits under their bed whenever voices were raised in the house, and baby Samuel seemed to cry more than any child should. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, the circuit physician visiting Cedar Creek monthly, examined Margaret during one visit after several women expressed concerns. He discovered nothing physically wrong, but noted in his private journal that she appeared nervous and melancholic, which he attributed to natural hysteria affecting women of childbearing age. His prescribed treatment included rest, fresh air, and daily laudanum doses to calm her nerves. The laudanum initially seemed helpful. Margaret's mood stabilized, and she managed household duties more effectively. However, the medicine also induced drowsiness and disconnection, and she began requiring larger doses for the same calming effect. Thomas, grateful his wife seemed more manageable, readily purchased whatever medicine she required, and didn't question her increasing dependence. By spring 1898, Margaret's condition had deteriorated significantly, though she had become expertly skilled at concealing it from casual observers. She learned to time her laudanum doses so she appeared most normal during church services and social gatherings, presenting a carefully maintained facade of competent motherhood that satisfied most people's concerns. However, those observing more closely began noticing disturbing signs. The children's clothing, while still clean, was often mismatched or poorly repaired. Meals became increasingly basic and repetitive: cornbread and milk for breakfast, cold biscuits for lunch, and thin soup for dinner. The house, once a model of frontier domesticity, began showing neglect signs, with dust accumulating in corners, windows remaining unwashed, and the vegetable garden that had once been Margaret's pride becoming overgrown with weeds. More troubling were the changes in Margaret's interactions with her children. She had always been a patient, nurturing mother, but now appeared to view them as burdens rather than blessings. She would snap at them for normal childhood behavior, become frustrated when they asked questions, and sometimes ignore them entirely for hours. The older children learned to care for baby Samuel themselves, taking turns feeding him and changing his diapers when their mother seemed unable to function. Thomas, when home, seemed oblivious to these changes. He was managing his own pressures, crop failures, mounting debts, and constant struggles to keep the farm profitable in an increasingly difficult economic climate. When neighbors occasionally mentioned concerns about Margaret, He would dismiss them with increasing irritation. "My wife is fine," he would state firmly. "She's simply tired from caring for 5 children. What woman wouldn't be? People need to mind their own business, instead of gossiping about things they don't understand." The truth was that Thomas felt deeply uncomfortable with any suggestion that his family wasn't perfect. In frontier life's rigid social structure, a man's worth was measured not only by his own success, but by his ability to maintain a proper household. Admitting Margaret was struggling would be equivalent to admitting his own failure as a husband and provider. During the long summer of 1898, Margaret's isolation became nearly complete. She stopped attending church services, claiming the children were too difficult to manage publicly. She declined invitations to quilting bees and harvest celebrations, always with polite excuses about household duties requiring attention, even when neighbors stopped by for visits. She would speak through the door, claiming she was too busy to receive company properly. The few people who did see her during this period were shocked by her physical deterioration. She had lost significant weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Her hair, once her crowning glory, was often unwashed and hastily pinned up. Her hands, never idle, even during conversation, showed constant nervous tremors she tried hiding by clasping them together. Most disturbing were her eyes. The bright green eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and warmth now seemed flat and lifeless, as if something essential inside had simply been extinguished. When she did speak, her voice had adopted a monotonous quality, and she often seemed to respond to conversations others couldn't hear. Baby Samuel's birth, in late 1898, seemed to trigger complete psychological collapse. The delivery was difficult, and Margaret lost dangerous amounts of blood, leaving her weak and unable to care for the infant properly. 4 weeks after birth, she remained in bed, staring at the ceiling, while older children attempted to manage household tasks they were too young to handle effectively. During this period, several neighbors offered assistance, but Margaret refused all help with almost violent determination. When Mrs. Morrison insisted on helping with laundry, Margaret became so agitated she began screaming at her to leave, frightening the children and creating a scene that became community gossip. "She's not right in the head," people began whispering. "Something's wrong with that woman, and those poor children are suffering for it." Despite these concerns, no one took decisive action. In 1898, there were no social services, no child protection agencies, and no real understanding of mental illness. A woman's behavior was considered her husband's responsibility, and unless she posed immediate physical threats to others, the community was reluctant to interfere in family matters. The winter of 1898 to 1899 proved particularly harsh, with unusually heavy snowfall that left the Yates farm isolated for weeks. Thomas was unable to travel for work, meaning he was home more often, but also increasingly frustrated by their deteriorating financial situation. The strain on the family became unbearable with 5 children crowded into a small house with 2 adults barely capable of caring for themselves, let alone their offspring. During this period, Margaret began exhibiting behavior that should have alarmed everyone witnessing it. She started conversing with herself constantly, carrying on elaborate conversations with invisible companions. When questioned about it, she would claim she was praying, but the words she muttered bore no resemblance to any prayers. The devoutly Methodist community would recognize. The children became increasingly fearful of their mother's unpredictable moods. One day, she might spend hours playing with them and telling stories, her old gentle nature briefly returning. The next day, she might lock herself in her bedroom and refuse to emerge, leaving them to fend for themselves while she wept or raged behind the closed door. 6-year-old William later told neighbors that his mother had begun waking the children during the night, insisting they needed to prepare for the journey. When asked what journey, she would become agitated and refuse to explain, instead forcing them to sit quietly in the kitchen while she paced the floor and muttered under her breath. Young Sarah developed a habit of wetting herself whenever her mother approached, as if her child's instincts recognized danger that adults couldn't see. The twins, barely 3 years old, began showing signs of severe anxiety, rocking back and forth, pulling their own hair, and refusing to eat unless coaxed by their older siblings. Most ominously, Margaret's relationship with baby Samuel became increasingly disturbed. She would stare at him for hours, with an expression of intense concentration, as if trying to solve some complex problem. When he cried, instead of comforting him, she would sometimes join in his wailing, creating a cacophony of misery that could be heard across the fields. Dr. Crawford, during his monthly visit in March 1899, was finally forced to acknowledge that Margaret's condition had progressed beyond simple female hysteria. He found her sitting motionless in her kitchen, baby Samuel crying in her lap while she stared straight ahead without blinking. When he spoke to her, it took several attempts to get her attention, and when she finally responded, her words were disconnected and strange. "They whisper at night," she told him matter-of-factly. "The children whisper, and they tell me things, terrible things about what's coming. The burden is too heavy, doctor, too heavy for anyone to carry." Dr. Crawford increased her laudanum prescription and suggested that Thomas consider sending her to stay with relatives in Austin until she recovered. But Thomas, now facing the possibility of losing his crops due to spring flooding, couldn't afford to lose his wife's labor and dismissed the suggestion as impractical. "She'll snap out of it," he insisted. "Women go through phases. She just needs to toughen up and remember her responsibilities." But Margaret wasn't snapping out of anything. If anything, her condition was accelerating toward a crisis that no one in the small community was equipped to handle. The signs were all there: the progressive isolation, the deteriorating care of the children, the increasingly bizarre behavior, and the growing sense among neighbors that something terrible was building in the Yates household like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In May 1899, Margaret made what would later be recognized as her final desperate attempt to communicate the severity of her situation. She appeared at Mrs. Morrison's home, disheveled and agitated, carrying baby Samuel, who was obviously ill with fever and malnutrition. "Helen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep them safe. Something terrible is going to happen, and I can't stop it. Please, you have to help me. You have to take them away from me before it's too late." Mrs. Morrison, alarmed by Margaret's appearance and words, tried to get her to explain what she meant. But Margaret had already begun backing away, shaking her head frantically. No, it's too late. They're telling me it's too late. The burden, the burden is mine to bear. I have to finish what was started. I have to free them from what's coming." Those were the last coherent words anyone would hear Margaret Yates speak. She turned and walked back across the fields to her house, baby Samuel crying weakly in her arms, leaving Mrs. Morrison standing in her doorway with a growing sense of dread that something unspeakable was about to unfold. Mrs. Morrison debated pursuing her, even considered walking to town to fetch Thomas from the general store where he was conducting business. But frontier etiquette strongly discouraged interfering in family matters without clear evidence of immediate danger, and Margaret's words, while disturbing, could be interpreted as the rambling of an exhausted mother rather than specific threats. It was a decision that would haunt Helen Morrison for the rest of her life, because within 3 weeks, Margaret Yates would act on whatever dark compulsion had been building in her tormented mind, and 5 innocent children would pay the ultimate price for their community's failure to understand the desperate warnings of a woman drowning in madness. Just when we thought we'd witnessed everything, the horror in the Yates household reaches its breaking point. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Click that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened during those final terrible days, when Margaret Yates made the unthinkable decision that would shock an entire community. The initial weeks of June 1899 brought an oppressive heat wave to eastern Texas, the kind of weather that shortened tempers and restless minds. The thermometer at Cedar Creek General Store regularly exceeded 100 degrees, with no relief even after sunset. In the Yates farmhouse, with its small windows and thick wooden walls, the heat became nearly unbearable, especially with 5 young children crowded into the small space. Thomas had departed on June 18th for what he expected to be a 3-day trip to Houston, where he hoped to secure better prices for his wheat crop than local buyers were offering. The family's financial situation had become desperate, and this trip represented their last hope of avoiding farm foreclosure. He kissed Margaret goodbye that morning, noting that she seemed unusually calm and quiet, but attributing it to the oppressive heat rather than any deeper concern. "Keep the children inside during the hottest part of the day," he instructed, unconsciously speaking to her as if she were hired help rather than his wife. "And don't let them waste water playing. We can't afford to have the well run dry." Margaret nodded silently, standing in the doorway with baby Samuel in her arms, while the other 4 children clustered around her skirts. Thomas later remembered thinking they made a peaceful domestic picture, a mother surrounded by her children, framed by morning light streaming through the open door. It was an image that would torment him in the years that followed, when he understood that he was looking at his family for the last time. The first day after Thomas's departure passed quietly. According to later neighbor testimony, Mrs. Morrison, still troubled by Margaret's strange visit weeks earlier, made a point of watching the Yates house from her kitchen window while she worked. She saw the children playing in the yard during cooler morning hours, their voices carrying across the fields in the still air. Everything seemed normal, perhaps even more peaceful than usual, but inside the house, Margaret was fighting a battle that no one could see. The voices that had been whispering to her for months had grown louder and more insistent, no longer content to remain in the background of her consciousness. They spoke with perfect clarity now, telling her things about her children that filled her with horror and desperation. The laudanum that had once helped quiet her mind now seemed to make the voices stronger. When she took her usual dose, instead of bringing peace, it seemed to open floodgates in her mind that she could no longer control. The bottle that Dr. Crawford had left with enough medicine for a month was already half empty, but the relief it provided was increasingly temporary and incomplete. On the morning of June 19th, Mrs. Morrison noticed that the Yates house seemed unusually quiet. No children's voices carried across the fields, no movement could be seen in the yard, and the usual smoke from the kitchen chimney was absent, even though it was time for the morning meal. Concerned, she decided to walk over after finishing her own chores, carrying a basket of fresh eggs as an excuse for the visit. When she knocked on the door, there was a long delay before Margaret answered. When she finally appeared, her transformation was shocking. In just 3 days, she seemed to have aged years. Her hair hung loose and unwashed around her shoulders. Her dress was stained and rumpled, as if she had slept in it, and her eyes had a wild, frightened quality that made Mrs. Morrison instinctively step backward. "Margaret, dear, I brought some eggs," Helen said, trying to keep her voice calm despite her growing alarm. "How are you managing with Thomas away?" "Managing?" Margaret repeated the word as if it were foreign to her. "Oh yes, managing. We're managing very well. The children are. They're being very good, very quiet. They understand now about being quiet." Mrs. Morrison tried to peer past Margaret into the house, but the interior was unusually dark, with curtains drawn across all the windows despite the bright morning sun. "Are the children feeling well? I haven't seen them playing outside." "They're resting," Margaret said quickly. "The heat, you know. It's important they rest during the heat. Thomas said to keep them inside, and I always do what Thomas says. I'm a good wife. I've always been a good wife." The conversation was stilted, and strange, with Margaret responding to questions that hadn't been asked and ignoring the ones that had been. Most disturbing of all, Mrs. Morrison realized she couldn't hear any sounds from inside the house. No children's voices, no footsteps, no crying from baby Samuel, who had seemed constantly fussy in recent months. "Margaret, I'd like to see the children, just to make sure they're all right," Mrs. Morrison said, taking a step forward. The effect of these words on Margaret was dramatic. Her face contorted with fear and rage, and she gripped the doorframe so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "No," she said sharply. "No, you can't see them. They're sleeping, and they mustn't be disturbed. They need their rest. They need ... They need to be ready." "Ready for what, Margaret?" But Margaret had already begun closing the door, shaking her head frantically. "You can't understand. No one can understand what it's like. The burden, the responsibility. But I know what has to be done. I know how to protect them." The door slammed shut, leaving Mrs. Morrison standing on the porch with a growing sense that something terrible was happening inside the house. She called out Margaret's name several times, but there was no response from within. After several minutes of indecision, she walked around the house, trying to peer through the curtained windows, but could see nothing in the dark interior. That evening, Mrs. Morrison discussed her concerns with her husband, Robert, who was reluctant to interfere in what he considered a family matter. "Margaret's always been a bit high-strung," he pointed out, "and it's natural she'd be nervous with Thomas away. We can't go breaking down doors just because a woman seems upset." But Helen Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She spent a restless night, frequently checking the view toward the Yates house from her bedroom window. The house remained dark and silent throughout the night, with no sign of the normal domestic activities that should have been taking place. The morning of June 20th, 1899, dawned clear and brutally hot, with the sun rising like a malevolent eye over the Texas plains. Mrs. Morrison was up before dawn, unable to sleep, and she immediately looked toward the Yates house. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Thin wisps of smoke were rising from the kitchen chimney, the first sign of activity she had observed in over a day. Relieved that Margaret seemed to be functioning and Helen decided to wait until a more appropriate hour before checking on her neighbor. She busied herself with morning chores, periodically glancing across the fields, but as the hours passed, her relief transformed back into worry. The smoke had stopped after only a short time, and once again, the house seemed unnaturally quiet. By 10 o'clock, when the Texas sun was already beating down mercilessly, Mrs. Morrison's anxiety had reached a breaking point. She convinced her husband to accompany her to the Yates house, using the excuse that she wanted to return a borrowed sewing basket. Robert Morrison was reluctant, but agreed, perhaps sensing his wife's genuine distress. As they approached the house, both of them noticed the overwhelming silence. On a normal day, the yard would have been alive with the sounds of children playing, but now there was nothing except the buzz of insects and the whisper of wind through the wheat fields. The house itself looked neglected, with shutters hanging askew and the front porch littered with objects that should have been put away. Robert knocked firmly on the door while Helen stood behind him, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. They could hear movement inside, slow, shuffling footsteps, but it took several minutes before the door opened. Margaret appeared in the doorway, and both visitors were shocked by her appearance. She was wearing a clean white dress that neither of them had seen before, and her hair was neatly braided and pinned up, but her face was ghostly pale, and her eyes had a strange glassy quality that made her look like a sleepwalker. "Good morning, Margaret," Robert said carefully. "We wanted to check on you and the children. Helen's been worried about you." Margaret stared at them for a long moment, as if trying to remember who they were. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm and formal, like someone reciting lines from memory. "How kind of you to call," she said. "I'm afraid the children can't receive visitors today. They're resting peacefully." Finally resting peacefully. Something in her tone made both visitors deeply uncomfortable. Robert tried to peer past her into the house, but Margaret shifted to block his view. "Margaret, are you feeling all right?" Helen asked gently. "You look very pale." "I feel relieved," Margaret said, and for the first time, a strange smile crossed her face. "The burden has been lifted. I've done what needed to be done. They're safe now. All of them are safe from what was coming." Robert and Helen exchanged alarmed glances. Robert cleared his throat and tried to speak with authority. "Margaret, I think we should see the children. Mrs. Morrison is concerned about their welfare." Margaret's calm facade cracked slightly, and her hands began to shake. "No one can see them. They're sleeping and they mustn't be disturbed. I've worked so hard to make sure they can sleep peacefully. They were so tired, you know. So very tired of carrying such heavy burdens." Helen Morrison felt a chill run down her spine despite the oppressive heat. Something was terribly wrong, and she suddenly understood that her worst fears about her neighbor might have come true. "Margaret," she said as gently as possible, "where are the children right now?" Margaret's smile returned, but it was unlike any expression Helen had ever seen on a human face, serene and terrible at the same time. "They're upstairs in their beds, sleeping like angels. Perfect little angels, who will never have to suffer again. I made sure of that. I'm a good mother, you know. The best mothers protect their children from suffering." Robert Morrison's face had gone white as the implications of Margaret's words sank in. Without asking permission, he pushed past her into the house, calling the children's names. Margaret didn't try to stop him. She simply stood in the doorway, that eerie smile still playing around her lips. The house was stifling hot and filled with a strange sweet smell that Robert couldn't identify. The downstairs rooms were neat and clean, but completely empty of the clutter and noise that 5 young children should have created. He bounded up the narrow stairs, Helen close behind him, both of them calling for William, Sarah, James, Mary, and baby Samuel. What they found in the children's bedroom would haunt them for the rest of their lives. All 5 children were lying in their beds, tucked in neatly with clean sheets pulled up to their chins. They looked peaceful, as if they were simply taking an afternoon nap, but their skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor, and they were completely motionless. Robert approached William's bed first, his hands shaking as he reached out to touch the boy's face. The skin was cold and rigid, and there was no doubt that the child had been dead for hours, possibly since the previous day. A quick check of the other children confirmed the horrible truth. All 5 of the Yates children were dead. Helen Morrison's scream of horror and disbelief echoed through the small house and across the fields, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to tear the very fabric of the peaceful morning. Robert stood frozen in the center of the room, trying to process the enormity of what they had discovered. Downstairs, Margaret had closed the front door and was sitting calmly in her rocking chair, humming a lullaby as if nothing unusual had happened. When the Morrisons came running down the stairs, Robert shouting questions and demands for explanation, she looked up at them with genuine surprise. "You woke them up," she said sadly. "I worked so hard to make sure they could sleep peacefully, and you woke them up. Now they'll be frightened again." It was then that Robert Morrison noticed the empty bottle on the kitchen table, the laudanum that Dr. Crawford had prescribed for Margaret's nerves. Next to it was a smaller bottle that had once contained paregoric, a medicine commonly used to treat children's stomach ailments. Both bottles were completely empty. The terrible truth was becoming clear. Margaret had given her children fatal doses of the opium-based medicines, probably mixed into their food or drink to mask the bitter taste. She had then carefully tucked them into their beds and waited for the drugs to take effect, believing in her disordered mind that she was protecting them from some unnamed horror. Robert Morrison ran from the house to summon help, leaving his wife to keep watch over Margaret, who seemed completely disconnected from reality. Helen sat in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, while Margaret continued to rock and hum, occasionally making comments about how peaceful the children looked and how glad she was that they were finally safe. When the sheriff arrived an hour later, followed by Dr. Crawford and several other men from town, Margaret greeted them politely and offered to make coffee as if they were paying a social call. She showed no resistance when they went upstairs to examine the children, and when they returned with grave faces to confirm what everyone already knew, she nodded as if they had delivered exactly the news she expected. It was the only way, she told them matter-of-factly. They were going to suffer so much. The voices told me what was coming, the terrible things that would happen to them if I didn't act. A good mother protects her children from suffering, even if it means making the hardest sacrifice of all. Dr. Crawford examined the children and confirmed that they had died from opium poisoning, probably administered the previous evening. The peaceful expressions on their faces suggested that they had simply fallen asleep and never awakened, unaware of what was happening to them. Thomas Yates returned from Houston that evening to find his world completely destroyed. The sheriff met him at the edge of town to break the news, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his 5 children lying still and silent in their beds, or his wife sitting calmly in the parlor, asking him how his business trip had gone, as if nothing had happened. The man who had left 3 days earlier as a struggling but hopeful farmer returned to find himself the sole survivor of a family that had been systematically destroyed by the very person he had trusted to protect it. Thomas collapsed beside William's bed, his anguished cries echoing through the house as the full reality of his loss finally hit him. Margaret watched her husband's breakdown with detached curiosity, occasionally offering comfort in the same tone she might use to console a child with a scraped knee. "Don't cry, Thomas," she said gently. "They're safe now. I made sure they're safe from all the terrible things that were coming." Isn't that what a good mother should do? When Dr. Crawford attempted to question Margaret about her actions, her responses revealed the depth of her psychological deterioration. She spoke matter-of-factly about the voices that had been telling her for months that her children were in danger, describing elaborate scenarios of suffering that would befall them if she didn't act to protect them. "They told me William would grow up to be a violent man, that he would hurt people," she explained with the same calm tone she might use to discuss the weather. "And little Sarah. They said terrible things would happen to her, things that no mother could bear to imagine. The twins were going